Today is May the 4th. Will the world that we live in end? Let's find out together as we study Mark chapter 13, verses 1 to 4. So in Mark 13, verses 1 to 4, we read these words. As Jesus was leaving the temple that day, one of his disciples said, "Teacher, look at these magnificent buildings. Look at the impressive stones in the walls." Jesus replied, "Yes, look at these great buildings, but they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another." Later, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives across the valley from the temple. Peter, James, John, and Andrew came to him privately and asked him, "Tell us, when will all this happen? What sign will show us that these things are about to be fulfilled?" So the disciples, looking at the temple, are amazed at its construction. Herod's temple took 47 and a half years to complete. And this was about 46 and a half into its construction. It's nearing completion, but it's not there yet. But it's magnificent. It is absolutely beautiful. The disciples comment on it. And Jesus takes the occasion to say, it won't be long, and this temple will be torn down. Now, Jesus takes occasion to teach about what in the Old Testament is called the day of the Lord, the day when God will come. In the Old Testament, we see some 25 to 30 times that the phrase day of the Lord is repeated. When it's repeated, two emotions are evoked in the minds of any Jew who reads it. First, they're filled with joy because as they look at the day of the Lord, they realize that God will come. God will step into history and God will change things. He'll make things right. But the other emotion that they feel is fear. Because every time the Old Testament talks about the day of the Lord, the prophets tell of gloom and doom. It's a day of destruction. The world itself will actually be destroyed. In the Old Testament, one of the first prophets to talk about the day of the Lord would have occurred in the 8th century before Christ. In the book of Amos, chapter 5, let's read verse 18 and verse 20. "What sorrow awaits you who say, 'If only the day of the Lord were here.' You have no idea what you're wishing for. That day will bring darkness, not light." Then in verse 20, "The day of the Lord will be dark and hopeless, without a ray of joy or hope." The day of the Lord is going to be difficult. Also an 8th century prophet, a contemporary with Amos, would be Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 13, verse 6 says this, "Scream in terror, for the day of the Lord has arrived, the time for the Almighty to destroy." Now, the northern tribes were conquered by Assyria, and they were taken away into captivity. While Israel was in the exile, in the book of Ezekiel, the exilic prophet Ezekiel, chapter 30, verse 3, Judah is now in Babylon. And Ezekiel prophesies. He says in verse 3, the terrible day is almost here. The day of the Lord, it's a day of clouds and gloom, a day of despair for the nations. The prophet Jeremiah also tells of the day of the Lord. Ezekiel was in Babylon prophesying to Israel. Jeremiah ended up in Egypt prophesying to another remnant of Israel that went south to avoid the exile. Chapter 46, verse 10. This is the day of the Lord of heaven's armies, a day of vengeance on his enemies. The sword will devour until it's satisfied. Yes, until it is drunk with your blood. So before the exile, the prophet said the day of the Lord was destruction. During the exile, they said the day of the Lord was destruction. And then after the exile, when Israel returned from Babylon and occupied Palestine again, the prophet Zephaniah spoke a lot about the day of the Lord, a very short book. But in Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 2, gather before judgment begins, before your time to repent is blown away like chaff. Act now before the fierce fury of the Lord falls and the terrible day of the Lord's anger begins. The day of the Lord brings his anger. And then in the book of Malachi, the very last verses of what we have as the Old Testament. Malachi chapter 4, verse 5. Look, I'm sending you the prophet Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord arrives. The day of the Lord comes, and it is not a pleasant thing. Let's pick it back up in Mark chapter 13. As we look ahead at the entire chapter, we see first in Mark chapter 13 that Jerusalem is destroyed. That takes place in the first 8 verses. Then in verse 9, the followers of Jesus are persecuted. Then, starting in verse 14, destruction will come to all. Beginning then in verse 21, the second coming of the Messiah will take place. And then finally, what Jesus says at the end of chapter 13. Make sure you're ready. Make sure you're prepared for all of this. This was why Jesus gave this teaching to the disciples. He wanted them to be prepared. So my question is, are you ready? You need to be a follower of Jesus. If you have never made that choice, take time to do that now. Please like and subscribe to this devotional on whatever platform you use to listen to it. Send your questions to questions@becomehope.com. Tomorrow, we'll begin to answer the question, when does all this take place?